They said it was impossible. You can build a water reservoir from old tires. You can solve a nation's water crisis with waste. In the arid plains of Burkina Faso, where droughts are an annual crisis, water is more than a necessity, it's a lifeline. But for generations, reliable access to clean water has been a distant dream for millions. The northern regions, where the average annual rainfall is only 600 millimeters, were suffering from a severe water shortage. Over 70% of the rural population in the Sahel region lacked access to safe and sustainable water sources. Farmers, children, and entire villages struggled to survive without consistent irrigation or clean drinking water. But against all odds, one leader saw hope in what others discarded. President Ibrahim Traoré, at just 35 years old, had taken on the monumental task of rebuilding his nation. Instead of begging the West for foreign aid, he turned to the resources his country already had discarded: tires. Millions of tires abandoned by Western factories and piled up in junkyards had long been seen as a burden. They choked the land and polluted the environment. But Traoré saw potential and opportunity to harness waste and turn it into a resource for the people of Burkina Faso. Why wait for the world to send us aid, he said. If they can build wealth from our resources, then we will build dignity from our ruins. The idea was revolutionary: use old discarded tires to create sustainable water reservoirs. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't clean, but it was practical. Using local labor, engineers, and university students, Traoré's team began transforming the tires into modular units that could be used to line reservoirs. The result was a simple, effective solution to a problem that had persisted for decades. In less than 6 months, the first reservoir was built, and for the first time, an entire village had access to a reliable water source. It wasn't just a solution to a water crisis, it was proof that innovation could emerge from the most unlikely places. The first tire-lined water reservoir was built in the village of Tambale, a small rural settlement in the northern region of Burkina Faso, a place where the dry winds of the Sahel blow across dusty roads and the land seems to swallow any hope of growth. Here, villagers had to walk miles every day just to fetch a small bucket of water. The river, often the only source, was dry for much of the year, leaving farmers with nothing to irrigate their crops and children with no clean water to drink. But then something extraordinary happened. Under President Ibrahim Traoré's leadership, engineers, local laborers, and university students came together to build the first tire reservoir. The process was simple but labor-intensive. Hundreds of tires were gathered from local junkyards, washed and prepared for use. Engineers crafted a durable lining using waterproof fabric, and the tires were stacked in a pattern that formed a solid structure to hold water. The tires were then filled with compressed soil and reinforced with additional layers of rubber to ensure the system's stability. At first there was skepticism. Critics called it an experiment, a desperate attempt to solve an age-old problem with a pile of junk. Would it hold water? Would it withstand the heat and the dry winds of the Sahel? But when the first tire reservoir was completed, it exceeded all expectations. The structure, which could hold up to 150,000 liters of water, was durable and effective. It stood firm through the scorching sun and dry season, providing water to over 10,000 people. The villagers who had once feared their crops would fail and children would go thirsty could now breathe a little easier. The tire reservoir had succeeded where many traditional methods had failed. It wasn't fancy, it didn't come with the high-tech solutions that foreign donors often promised, but it worked. For the first time in decades, Tambale had a reliable, sustainable water source, and this was just the beginning. The impact of the first tire reservoir was nothing short of transformative. What started as a modest project soon became a lifeline for the people of Tambale, and the ripple effect spread throughout the region. The reservoir didn't just provide water, it provided hope, and with it a new sense of possibility. For the first time, farmers in Tambale had consistent access to water for irrigation. Previously, the village relied on seasonal rainfall, that was unpredictable and insufficient. Crops often withered, and livestock perished due to lack of water. But with the new Traore reservoir, farmers could irrigate their fields year-round, ensuring a steady supply of food and income. The village's economy, which had once been on the brink of collapse, began to recover. Crops like millet, maize, and sorghum flourished in abundance, feeding families and providing surplus for trade. For the children, the difference was even more profound. Before the reservoir, young boys and girls had to spend hours each day trekking to distant wells or rivers to fetch water. The journey was dangerous, especially for the girls who were vulnerable to assaults and accidents. The new water supply freed them from this burden, allowing them to attend school instead of carrying heavy containers of water on their heads. The increased access to water also improved sanitation and reduced waterborne diseases, which had been a persistent health problem in rural Burkina Faso. "We used to wait for the rain to come, but we never knew when it would come," said Mariama, a local farmer. "Now we have water when we need it. We can plant, we can feed our families, and we can dream." The success of the Traore reservoir became a model for other villages. As word spread, neighboring towns began to request similar solutions. The project showed them that sustainable water solutions did not need to come from foreign aid or expensive infrastructure projects. They could be homegrown, built from the very materials that others consider it waste. Ibrahim Traoré had proven that resourcefulness and innovation could transform lives. Once the success of the first Traore reservoir and Traore became clear, the ripple effect began to grow exponentially. Other villages across Burkina Faso, many of which face similar water scarcity issues, looked to Traore as a beacon of hope. What started as a single project soon turned into a national movement, one that proved that Africa didn't have to rely on external aid or foreign expertise to solve its own problems. Within a few months, 10 more Traore reservoirs were constructed in neighboring villages. Each new reservoir was larger, more refined, and capable of holding more water. The materials were sourced locally, keeping the costs low, while creating jobs for local laborers. By mid-2025, over 100,000 people had access to sustainable water sources, thanks to these Traore reservoirs, with additional projects planned for the coming year. The project's success didn't go unnoticed by other nations. Across Africa, other leaders began to see the potential in Traore's innovation. In Niger, Mali, and Chad, leaders began to discuss the Traore reservoir model as a viable solution to their own water crises. Environmentalists in the region also took note, praising the Traore reservoirs for their sustainability and low environmental impact. Traores, which once polluted landfills and contributed to environmental degradation, were now being repurposed into life-saving infrastructure. But the project wasn't just about building reservoirs. It was about changing the mindset of an entire generation. Traore's leadership was proving that Africa's future didn't have to be tied to foreign aid or charity. Through innovation, self-reliance, and resourcefulness, nations could build their own future from what they already had. As more reservoirs were constructed, the broader impact began to be felt across the region. The Traore reservoirs didn't just provide water, they created a sense of community and ownership. The people involved in the construction of the reservoirs, from local engineers to university students, became active participants in shaping their future. Instead of relying on the traditional model of foreign expertise, they became the experts, and in doing so, their sense of pride and self-sufficiency grew. However, not everyone was pleased with this rapid expansion. While African nations hailed the Traore reservoirs as a breakthrough, the international community remained skeptical. Some Western organizations viewed the project as a temporary solution, arguing that it lacked the long-term sustainability and scale of large-scale foreign infrastructure projects. They criticized the project's reliance on local materials and its relatively low-tech approach. Many questioned whether it could be replicated on a larger scale. But Traore wasn't concerned with international approval. His focus remained on Burkina Faso and its people, We don't need to wait for approval from others, he said. We know what works for us. And for the people of Burkina Faso, it was working. The Traore reservoirs became more than just a way to manage water. They became symbols of resilience and pride. Communities that had once been dependent on external aid were now building their own solutions. Schools were now open year-round because children no longer had to spend hours fetching water. Crops were thriving, boosting local economies and giving farmers the tools to plan for the future. The Traore reservoirs had not just solved the water crisis, they had unlocked the potential for sustainable development and self-reliance. As the project expanded to international organizations, once dismissive of Traoré's idea began to take notice. In 2026, a report from the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, highlighted the Traore Reservoir Initiative as a prime example of sustainable development in Africa. Burkina Faso has shown the world what's possible when a nation takes ownership of its own resources, the report read. But Traoré's vision was far from complete. While the Traore reservoirs had provided much-needed relief to his people, he knew that Burkina Faso's path to true independence wasn't just about water. It was about creating a foundation of self-reliance and economic and political shift that would reverberate across the entire continent. As the Traore Reservoir initiative gained momentum across Burkina Faso, it didn't take long for the world to take notice. The global reaction to President Ibrahim Traoré's unconventional solution was a mixture of skepticism, admiration, and quiet concern, especially in the halls of power in Washington, Paris, and London. At first, the Western media was dismissive. International outlets like African News and Reuters questioned the feasibility of Traoré's Traore reservoirs. Headlines like Burkina Faso's Traore Revolution, a symbolic stunt or a real solution, and can recycled Traore solve Africa's water crisis, suggested that the project was little more than a desperate attempt to make a nation's failure look like a triumph. The Western critics pointed out that the reservoirs, while effective in the short term, lacked the technical sophistication of large-scale projects funded by international donors. There were concerns about the long-term environmental impact of reusing tires, especially if they were exposed to harsh weather conditions for extended periods of time. Critics argued that the project was nothing more than a patchwork solution for a much larger systemic problem. However, as the Traore reservoirs began to improve the lives of thousands of Burkinabe citizens, the criticism gradually softened. Reports of farmers doubling their crop yields and children attending school without the burden of fetching water began to shift the narrative. Slowly, the Traore reservoirs were acknowledged as a low-cost, sustainable solution to water scarcity, and in some circles a model for grassroots innovation. In contrast, some African nations viewed the success of the Traore reservoirs with both admiration and trepidation. Leaders in Ghana, Nigeria, and Togo expressed interest in replicating the project, seeing it as a potential game-changer for their own water scarcity issues. Yet they were cautious. There was a reluctance to adopt Traoré's methods outright without first evaluating the long-term viability of the reservoirs. But the most significant shift came from within the international community itself. In 2026, after seeing the success of the Traore reservoirs, China began to show interest in supporting the initiative. Chinese companies eager to make inroads in Africa with sustainable technology offered technical expertise and funding to expand the Traore reservoir model across the continent. Their involvement was seen as a strategic move to further strengthen China's ties with African nations and promote Chinese-made technologies as alternatives to Western aid. Meanwhile, in Washington, the reaction was mixed. While the State Department remained cautious in its official statements, private think tanks and policy circles began to debate the broader implications of Traoré's project. Analysts at the Council on Foreign Relations wondered, could Burkina Faso's Traore Reservoir initiative be the first step toward a new African economic model, one that was self-sustaining, resourceful, and independent of foreign aid? In Europe, the reactions were more diplomatic. Countries like France, which had a long history of political and economic influence in the Sahel region, were wary of the project's success. Some feared that if the Traore Reservoir project were widely adopted, it would undermine the entire aid infrastructure that many European governments had spent decades cultivating in Africa. At the same time, some European leaders saw it as a potentially transformative example of African ingenuity that deserved support. But despite the international chatter, one thing was clear: Traore's Traore Reservoirs were challenging the narrative of African dependency. And in doing so, they were forcing the world to rethink its approach to development in Africa. The success of the Traore Reservoir project in Burkina Faso began to change how the world viewed Africa. It was no longer just a local solution to a water crisis. It had become a symbol of African self-reliance. President Ibrahim Traoré's vision resonated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders, inspiring a new sense of pride and possibility across the continent. Countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and Togo were already exploring ways to replicate the Traore Reservoir model. In Kenya, students and engineers were experimenting with recycling initiatives based on the same principles. This wasn't just about solving water scarcity. It was about proving that Africa could innovate without relying on foreign aid. International media outlets, including Al Jazeera and BBC, began to take a more positive stance. The Traore Reservoir model was recognized as a breakthrough, with some praising it as a new development paradigm. The United Nations also took note with their 2026 report, calling it a model for sustainable, self-sustaining development that could be adapted across Africa. The success of the project was about more than water. It symbolized Africa's potential to solve its own problems and assert its independence. The message was clear: Africa was not just a continent to be saved. It was a continent capable of saving itself. And this shift in mindset wasn't just about infrastructure. It was about reclaiming control over its future. China, too, saw the promise in Burkina Faso's model. Chinese companies began offering technical support, further solidifying Africa's position as a partner in global development, rather than a dependent region. This was not a mere innovation, it was a paradigm shift. By late 2026, Burkina Faso's Traore Reservoirs had evolved into a symbol of Africa's rising independence. Traoré's words echoed across the continent. We never asked permission to be free. We stood and we claimed it. His leadership sparked a movement that transcended Burkina Faso's borders, inspiring a new generation of Africans to believe that their future was in their own hands. In Mali, youth groups launched recycling initiatives. In Niger, young engineers proposed similar water management projects. Across the Sahel, a new spirit of self-sufficiency began to take root, showing that the continent had the resources and creativity to address its challenges. Africa's youth were no longer waiting for foreign aid, they were taking charge of their own development. Economic impacts were profound. In rural areas, farmers thrived, crops flourished, and markets expanded. What started as a simple solution to water scarcity became a powerful economic engine, boosting local economies and providing new opportunities for African communities. Internationally, the Traore Reservoirs became a symbol of Africa's ability to stand on its own. The World Bank praised the model as a step towards sustainable growth, and the UNDP highlighted it as a success story for African-led innovation. Traoré's message resonated globally. We have no steel, no oil, no empire. But we have hands, and hands build history. His words signified a new Africa, one that could solve its own problems, create its own future, and most importantly, build its own dignity. As Burkina Faso continued to expand its Traore Reservoirs, the world was forced to reconsider its assumptions about Africa. The continent was no longer waiting for aid, it was building, innovating, and leading. This was the dawn of a new Africa, a continent rising on its own terms.